Here to talk about the Blue Dogs a little bit and about Welcome Pack. I think I'll start by saying I'm a fan of the work that Liam and Lauren and everyone at Welcome Pack has been doing to help bring common sense and normalcy to our politics. And it's great to be here with you all today. I'm here primarily because I worked with a group of colleagues to save the Blue Dog Coalition from a near extinction, and then took on the position of co-chair with an eye towards the future. The Blue Dogs are a decades-old caucus that prioritizes fiscal stability, national security, and a willingness to work across the aisle to get things done for the American people. But I believe the Blue Dogs can be more than that. We can be proud, progressive conservatives, defying the laws of physics and DC politics and forming a covenant with the true American majority. Our success is going to depend on two things. First is our commitment to place-based politics, which transcends partisanship and defeats extremism. You heard Marie talk about that. Second is going to be rejecting the unnatural left-right political spectrum that stokes division and polarization. Let's start with place-based politics. Blue Dogs are focused on people who are turned off by fringe elements in our politics, and that means we're focused on the reality that normal people are living. We all know that our political culture amplifies extreme voices, sometimes so much that weird, unpopular ideas enter the mainstream. Consider some Democrats' brief, dangerous flirtation with defund the police as a slogan, or Republicans' long-running obsession with shrinking government so small that it can lurk right next to your bed to keep an eye on you during the most intensely private and personal moments of your life. To most Americans, these ideas are both weird and wrong. And before they'll support a candidate for Congress or for any office, they want to know that doing that doesn't require their sign-off on these extreme visions or policies. In other words, they want to know that their representative isn't for extremists and weirdos, but for them, their families, and their communities. My work with the Blue Dogs comes from my determination to make sure that we create space for people like that within the People's House. People like me, like the ones I grew up with in Leeds, Maine. So I'll tell you about where I'm from. My family originally lived in Lewiston, Maine. That's where I live now. But back then, that was an industrial town that for generations was dominated by textile mills and shoe factories, but lost those jobs to globalization. So my father's family moved 20 miles north to a town called Winthrop. Later on in life, by the time I was born, my parents ran a multi-generation small business just a few miles away in Leeds, Maine. A dairy farm town back then, but today, the cows are mostly gone. Maine's 2nd congressional district is massive. It's it's the largest east of the Mississippi River. 2nd most rural congressional district in the country. It's full of communities like Lewiston and Leeds. Our economy was built on the land and the water. Primary natural resource industries like fishing, farming, and logging fueled secondary industries like canning and food processing, lumber mills, and paper making. Others made a living through tourism, different from production but equally tied to our land and water. Teachers, police officers, firefighters, and others rounded out our working class communities. My community and so many others are full of normal people who want normal things from their government. Good schools, great schools, public safety, infrastructure that works, a viable path for working class people to sustain themselves and their families. But if you'd asked me as a kid, I couldn't tell you which of the farmers in town were Republicans or Democrats, or whether my parents' customers voted red or voted blue. In fact, most of them weren't either. When I was 10 years old, a guy with big ears named Ross Perot won the town I grew up in, and he nearly won the congressional district I represent today. Sorry in advance to the defenders of neoliberalism, but that guy made a lot of good points in the eyes of my constituents. But what bound everyone together when I was growing up in Leeds wasn't a political identity. It was the hours and years working together and spending time together. The time spent in diners, church pews, on stumps around a fire, and school gymnasium bleachers. What connected us was the place, the people, and the way of life. It was our culture, local culture. I joined the Marines after 9/11, and when I came home after 4 years in Afghanistan and Iraq, it was those bonds I relied on. Like a lot of veterans, re-entering civilian life wasn't straightforward. But my family, friends, even strangers in the community, they were there for me. They gave me work, encouraged me to go to Bates and finish college. They encouraged me when I decided to run for the Maine legislature and eventually Congress. I've always run as a Democrat. I believe in the power and necessity of unions, inequality, and civil rights. But I won a lot of votes from Republicans and independents too, and from Democrats who no longer feel much in common with the Democratic Party. I believe they vote for me because they know I'm one of them. I'm from where they're from. I live like them, talk like them, always have. The men and women and their families who I grew up playing sports with, getting into trouble with after school, those folks and people like them are the reason I'm here today. Serving them as a 3-term incumbent Democrat, all while many of them also vote for former President Donald Trump. They trust that when necessary, I'll stand up for them against people who don't care about them in Washington, or where they're from, or how they've lived, even when that means standing up to my own party, actually, especially when it means standing up to my own party. This is how place-based politics transcends partisanship. When I oppose regulations from the Biden administration that would undermine our lobster fishery, I'm not fighting against him alongside Republicans. I'm fighting him on behalf of lobstermen. When I vote for bills supported by Democrats, I don't do it because I'm a Democrat who wants to give our party or the president from our party a win. I voted for the infrastructure bill because Maine is a big, massive rural state with big infrastructure needs. I voted for the Inflation Reduction Act because ours is one of the oldest states where seniors need lower health care costs. I voted for the CHIPS and Science Act because being from a state still reeling from trade deals that did lead to mill closures and jobs going overseas, I know how important it is to make investments that ensure we're a nation of producers, not just consumers. That's what place-based politics is all about. Putting loyalty to your district and your people first, putting their culture and their way of life first, before any agenda of a political party or president. And when you stick to it, when you demonstrate loyalty to your district year after year, that's what proves to your people that no matter what the weirdos on the fringe of your party might do or say, there's room for normal people in our politics. There's room for what I call progressive conservatives. Going off script for just a minute, people wonder where that phrase comes from. It actually comes from a construction worker in my district in 2018 in October, just before the election. People were wondering if we'd be able to flip that red seat to one held by a Democrat. And a guy on my team came up to our office and said, well, I think you've won the election because this guy just asked me, what are you doing here? Your accent tells me you're not from around. And he said, I'm working for Jared Golden. The guy said, well, that's that progressive conservative Marine. So we took that and made it our own. But we knew right then and there that we'd gotten through to the people that we were talking about and who were going to decide the outcome of the election. So none of this is to say that practicing this kind of politics always makes you popular. The fact that I can win a district Trump also wins makes me a target for the national Republicans every single election. And the team sports activists in my own party howl whenever I break with leadership. Both would rather I be replaced with someone else. To their credit, they can both sense the same thing we do, that most people reject extremism. So the GOP spends tens of millions of dollars to tell voters I'm a dangerous leftist, pushing open borders and socialism. Some of my rigidly left-wing colleagues in the most extreme elements of the base say I'm a dino, an apologist for authoritarians on the right. These are obviously lies. Others, especially in the press, try to label me with less incendiary terms. Some tag me as a centrist or a moderate, terms I know many people in this room embrace. And honestly, that's fine. But for me, those labels evoke a place somewhere in the middle of this left-right axis. To be honest, I'm just as uncomfortable with those labels. Here's why. I believe the most dominant lie of our political culture is the idea that we can all be reduced to our place on this left-right political axis. There's an axis that, this axis, actually, this is getting very wonky history stuff if we got history buffs in the room. It comes from revolutionary France. It's based on what side of the room the allies and opponents of the king sat on. In the centuries since, political scientists and academics and pundits have developed it into what we know today. But it's all made up. The political spectrum doesn't exist in nature. There's nothing real and tangible to where things belong on the political spectrum because it's a construct of the human mind that is constantly in flux. It's constantly changing, and it means different things place to place, country to country, and even era to era. And yet we're subject to this constant narrative that tells us that the political spectrum is the only way to understand politics. And while this crude access may provide limited benefit as a shorthand in our political conversations, I believe it's far more harmful than it is illuminating. Left-right politics is a root cause of much of the polarization we see today. After all, if this is the correct way to understand politics, then the only rational strategy for political parties is to move further to the extremes. Some pundits say this is a good thing, by the way, that polarization heightens the contrast between the parties and clarifies choices for voters to make. There's two problems, I think, with that approach. First, it's extremely divisive. The country is very divided by our politics. As the parties continue to polarize and rhetoric gets hotter and hotter, partisanship starts to feel almost existential. People who push this narrative would have you believe party ID is the entirety of your own identity. This view of politics would turn people with whom you have good faith disagreements into sworn enemies. Pressure builds to choose between party affiliation and colleagues at work. Lifelong friendships splinter along partisan lines. Even the bond of family, the strongest of all, is tested and too often breaks. Second, left-right politics ignore the complexities of actual people and voters. Each of us has progressive and conservative impulses. These are not in tension, and building a political system that puts them in opposition is a recipe for disaster for the country. Here's an example of progressive conservatism. I've told voters for years that I believe we should raise taxes on the wealthy to help cut the deficit. When I discuss this with voters, most of them agree. These are very popular ideas. They poll very well if you're into following polls and making policy decisions on them. It's a very mainstream proposal. But left-right politics doesn't know what to do with a proposal like that. Progressives who normally favor raising taxes on the rich would reject it, convinced that any concern with a deficit is a dog whistle for cuts to social insurance programs for the poor. Conservatives oppose it because their devotion to fiscal responsibility ends at raising taxes on the wealthy, even to balance the budget and save the nation from fiscal ruin. I speak with Democrats who support Trump's tariffs as an effort to support American manufacturing. I speak with Republicans all the time who love their union and want workers in other jobs to have the same power that they have to advocate for themselves. This is what I mean when I talk about progressive conservatives. In our day-to-day lives, these are not contradictions. They reflect the reality of an electorate that refuses to be so neatly categorized. Some people in this room and in our party may say that what I'm saying is like a rehashing of the third way politics of the late 20th century. But for me, progressive conservative thought is not about mixing, let's say, social liberalism and fiscal conservatism, as so many commonly refer to that center and center-left space of American politics. For me, there's an obvious and rightful consensus within the Democratic Party and in America on the so-called social issues of the 20th century. These rights are still at risk because many Republicans do believe, particularly in Washington, they believe with conviction in restricting these rights, or they'll use them as wedge issues to win elections. But most Americans don't agree with them. And when Republicans run elections on these issues, they lose. Democrats everywhere should take note of this. And so I think the concept of social liberalism is no longer a useful way to talk about the diversity of thought within the Democratic Party. And what does being a fiscal conservative even mean in an era where, let's be honest, both parties continue to come up with new excuses to add to the national debt whenever they're in control? For me, if I had to distill progressive conservative down into a similarly brief phrase, like socially liberal, fiscally conservative, I would probably say progressive economics, cultural conservatism. Progressive economics is something you can probably grasp without my really getting into it. Tax the rich to cut the deficit, pro-business and antitrust. Corporate welfare is bad, direct payments to families is good. Financialization of the economy is sometimes bad. Protective tariffs are sometimes good. But when I say cultural conservatism, I want to be clear, I'm not referring to the social issues and social conservatism that split the 20th century Democratic Party. What I'm referring to is a political fault line I believe most Democrats don't even know exists. It's backlash among my constituents to climate change policies like electric vehicle mandates and higher energy prices. Notice I didn't say opposition to electric vehicles, but rather to mandates. Hearing about ever-expanding levels of student debt amnesty for college kids, they see trashing campuses on TV, while working people who didn't go to college are just trying to make their car payments and maybe someday buy a home like their parents did. Their concerns about crime and an unsecured southern border and being told those aren't real issues is actually concerning to them. Some pundits have tried to explain this mix of economic and cultural impulses as populism. Their idea of populism is that it's a force that can be used to harness people behind leaders like Bernie Sanders and the Squad on the left, or Trump, J.D. Vance, Josh Hawley on the right. The idea that these politicians share some political DNA despite being polar opposites. Populism is actually a real force in politics and provides a far better way to understand the electorate than this old left-right spectrum, but not as a force that can be used in service of left-right politics. Populist energy comes from the vast majority of Americans who don't fit neatly onto this spectrum. It's expressed in alternating waves of rage, despair, towards the centers of power in Washington. It's the public's disdain of a consensus in Washington that seems stacked in favor of the powerful and wealthy, regardless of party or ideology. Where I come from, it's rage at things like trade policies championed by Democrats and Republicans alike that ship jobs or entire industries overseas, putting our trade sheets in deficit in service of shareholder profits. It's discussed with politicians who leverage public service into landing seven-figure jobs within days of losing an election. It's despair that even after dutifully voting in every single election, year after year, they're told this is the one that's the most important of their lives. And yet they're still facing the same challenges in their day-to-day lives years after that election. In politics, newcomers or outsiders sometimes ride this wave right into office. But once they're there, it's over for them. It will always end up being that populism is a force aimed at the powerful. Our job isn't to harness it, it's to feel it, and to use our power as elected officials to chip away at the consensus that so many Americans feel has turned against them. Left-right politics tells us we need to join one of these partisan teams. Rejecting it frees us to join voters in attacking the root challenges that fuels anger and frustration in this country. Anyone in any party who does that will be able to overcome the challenges of partisanship and polarization. That's the promise of thought like progressive conservatism. In Congress, it's not enough for any one member to take this on by themselves. Luckily, Blue Dogs aren't alone. While we have our differences, we share common cause with other factions of Democrats and Republicans in Congress. Our visions and strategies differ, but we're running in the same direction. I'm confident that this project can be a success. Many of us are fed up with the status quo of hyperpartisanship, polarization, and politics as a team sport where no matter who wins, it feels like everyone's losing somehow. The Blue Dog bark is getting louder, and with support from organizations like the Welcome Party, I think you'll see that our pack is going to get bigger pretty soon. So thanks again for having me. Thanks for having these important discussions, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.